Case 1. Vicki Dawn Jackson. This is the disturbing account of a small-town nurse in northern Texas who was believed to have ended the lives of at least 10 patients, people who trusted her completely, right there in the quiet wards of a community hospital where everyone knew everyone's name. There is a particular kind of trust that lives inside a small-town hospital, one that has nothing to do with institutional policy and everything to do with geography. When you are a patient in a facility like Nocona General Hospital in northern Texas, the person monitoring your condition in the middle of the night is not a stranger. She grew up down the road from you. Her children sat in classrooms with your grandchildren. The world outside the hospital walls and the community inside it are the same community, linked by decades of shared history. That closeness is supposed to feel like safety, and for a long time, for the people of Nocona, Texas, it did. Vicki Dawn Jackson, a caregiver working in Nocona General Hospital, was 34 years old when the crimes began. Her victims were elderly members of her own community, people who likely recognized her face, and the deaths occurred between December 2000 and February 2001. What made this case even more disturbing was how long it took for anyone to notice the pattern. We rank this case at number 1 because it represents a betrayal so intimate, so close to home, that it fundamentally challenges the idea of safety in small-town America. But what could really drive a caregiver to harm the very people she swore to protect? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Nocona is a small city in Montague County, a place where personal histories are largely public and trust between neighbors is more assumption than choice. Vicki Dawn Jackson was born there on February 13, 1966. She grew up inside that town, attended its schools, and in her younger years spoke of wanting to become a nurse in the tradition of devoted caregivers. She trained, qualified, and by 1989 was a licensed vocational nurse working across various North Texas facilities before returning to Nocona General Hospital in late 2000. In her early months at Nocona General, Jackson presented as exactly what the small hospital needed: quiet, steady, reliable. She worked the night shift, kept to herself in the way that competent people sometimes do, and drew no notable complaints from supervisors or colleagues. In a low-resource community hospital that depended heavily on every member of its staff, those qualities counted for something. Nobody was looking beneath them. Between December 11, 2000 and February 18, 2001, a span of just over 10 weeks, 10 patients at Nocona General Hospital stopped breathing during Vicki Jackson's overnight shifts. 10 patients. None of them were in the terminal stages of an illness. They were elderly residents, lifelong members of the community, parents and grandparents whose faces Jackson would have recognized at the supermarket or the diner. One was a woman near Jackson's own age, whom she had likely seen at the same local venues. Another was a teenage girl who attended school with Jackson's own children. The drug involved was mivaquirium chloride, a muscle-paralyzing agent used only in carefully controlled surgical settings to temporarily immobilize patients during procedures. It had no routine place in a small community hospital's general care environment. What this drug does to a person when administered outside that context is clinically precise and deeply serious. It causes full muscular paralysis, including the muscles required for breathing, while leaving the person entirely conscious and aware.
The person cannot signal distress. They cannot call out. They cannot resist in any way. Medical professionals who later described this method during the investigation used phrases like "among the cruelest" available to someone with pharmaceutical access. Jackson did not attempt to intervene when patients on her shifts began deteriorating. She allowed the respiratory failures to progress. Each incident presented the appearance of a natural medical event, the kind of respiratory episode that does occasionally occur in a hospital setting, particularly among elderly patients. Early deaths drew no immediate suspicion. It was only when the number of incidents on a single nurse's shifts became statistically impossible to rationalize that investigators began examining the pattern with genuine seriousness. The investigation accelerated when a syringe containing traces of mivacurium was found in a trash can at Jackson's home. Both she and her husband, who worked at Nakona General as a nurse's aide, denied any knowledge of it. Her husband was eventually cleared of any involvement. Evidence established that he had no access to controlled medications and no role in what had occurred. Jackson remained the only common thread. During interrogation sessions with FBI Special Agent David Burns, what emerged was not a complex or ideologically motivated explanation. Jackson reportedly described acting in moments of frustration during her shifts, stating that certain patients were too demanding, too difficult to manage during her overnight hours. She could not offer a clearer justification. There was no financial motive. There was no mercy-based rationale. No claim that she was ending anyone's suffering. The explanation, such as it was, centered on irritation. Certain patients frustrated her, and she had the access and the pharmaceutical knowledge to act on that frustration. Jackson was arrested on July 16, 2006, more than 5 years after the last confirmed death. The legal process stretched further still. A first trial in 2005 ended in a mistrial after judicial intervention over prosecutorial comments. A second trial was being prepared in San Angelo following a change of venue. On October 3, 2006, midway through jury selection for that second proceeding, Jackson entered a plea of no contest to 10 counts of capital murder. Her attorney noted that her own daughter had been placed on the state's witness list, a factor that reportedly influenced the decision. She received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors had not sought the death penalty. Jackson has continued to publicly maintain her innocence, a position that sits uneasily alongside the physical evidence, the FBI interviews, and the voluntary nature of her plea. An attempt in 2015 to secure a new trial and challenge the syringe evidence did not succeed. She remains at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas, with a projected parole consideration date of 2042. What the Vicki Jackson case ultimately reveals is something about the architecture of trust in small communities. Night shifts in low-staffed rural hospitals offer limited oversight. Elderly patients in isolated rooms are the least positioned to advocate for themselves. And a nurse who grew up in the same town, who shares community ties with the patients and their families, sits inside a web of assumed trustworthiness that is genuinely difficult to see past. Jackson knew all of this intimately. She had grown up knowing it, and the intimacy that defined Nakona, the very thing that was supposed to make its community safer, became the condition under which 10 people who had no reason to doubt her never got the chance to.
Case 2. Carla Faye Tucker. This is the deeply controversial story of a young woman from Houston, Texas, who committed one of the most violent double murders the state had ever seen. A crime so savage it sent shockwaves through the entire country and sparked a debate that has never truly gone quiet. There is an argument, a serious one made by serious people, that the person who commits a crime is not the same person who faces the consequences for it 14 years later. It is a philosophical argument about identity, about what punishment is actually designed to achieve, about whether justice should account for who a person has become rather than only who they were. Texas wrestled with that argument in a very public way between 1984 and 1998. The name at the center of it was Carla Faye Tucker. Carla Faye Tucker was 23 years old when the crime occurred on June 13, 1983. Her victims were Jerry Lynn Dean, 27, and Deborah Ruth Thornton, 32, a woman who had simply been in the wrong place on the wrong night. The crime scene was so brutal that investigators were visibly shaken. And 14 years later, the world was divided over whether justice was truly served. We ranked this case at number 2 because no other case on this list ignited a bigger national debate about redemption, faith, and the true purpose of punishment. But what could have pushed Carla Faye Tucker so far past the edge of humanity on that June night? Let's jump into the details to find out. Carla Faye Tucker was born in Houston on November 18, 1959, into a family environment that offered almost none of the protections a child requires. Her mother's lifestyle exposed her to substances and adult situations at an age when most children's most pressing concerns involve homework and playdates. By her own later account, she was introduced to drug use before she reached double digits. By early adolescence, she had left school and was traveling with bands as part of a circuit that funded itself through addiction and survival. It is not a childhood built for stability. The adults responsible for her either could not or would not provide it. By her early 20s, Tucker was embedded in Houston's biker community, living a life defined by heavy substance use and complicated relationships. One figure in her orbit was Jerry Lynn Dean, a man whose estranged wife was Tucker's acquaintance. Tucker reportedly carried personal grievances against Dean involving disputes over property and a history of tension between them. She had, according to accounts shared with associates in the weeks before June 13, 1983, spoken openly about wanting to settle those grievances. What happened in the days immediately before the murders is central to understanding the night itself. Tucker, her boyfriend Daniel Ryan Garrett, and others spent multiple days in a state of extreme intoxication, combining heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and numerous other substances in a prolonged period that left them sleep-deprived and disconnected from ordinary judgment. During this period, conversations circulated about going to Dean's apartment to retrieve a motorcycle or confront him over money. The stated intention was robbery and intimidation. What ultimately happened went far beyond that, or at least that is how the participants later framed the gap between intention and outcome.
In the early morning hours of June 13th, Tucker and Garrett, accompanied by an associate named James Librant, made their way to Dean's apartment complex. Tucker had taken apartment keys from Dean's estranged wife without her knowledge. They entered while Dean and a woman named Deborah Ruth Thornton, who had met Dean at a party the day before and was spending the night, were asleep. What followed inside that apartment cannot be described in graphic terms here, but what the evidence established is this. Both Dean and Thornton were attacked and died from their injuries. Dean was 27 years old, Thornton was 32. She had simply been at the wrong address on the wrong night. Someone with no prior connection to the grievances that had set the evening in motion. Tucker was arrested on July 20, 1983. The evidence against her was substantial. Librant testified about what he had witnessed, and Tucker had reportedly described the events to multiple associates, providing details that no uninvolved person would have known. She and Garrett were tried separately. Tucker was convicted in 1984 of capital murder for the death of Jerry Lynn Dean. Both received death sentences. Garrett's conviction was later overturned on appeal, and he died of liver disease in prison in 1993 while awaiting retrial. Tucker's conviction held. What happened to Carla Faye Tucker between her conviction and her execution is genuinely complicated to assess. Shortly after her arrest, she became a committed Christian, not in a performative way, but in a manner that multiple observers, including professionals whose job was to evaluate such claims, described as sincere and sustained. She married a prison minister. She worked with other incarcerated women. She gave interviews, expressed remorse, and spoke against the path her early life had taken. The prison warden testified to her transformation. By the mid-1990s, her case had drawn international attention. Pat Robertson, Pope John Paul II, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and, perhaps most strikingly, Ronald Carlson, the brother of victim Deborah Thornton, all made appeals for clemency. Carlson, who had initially supported the execution, later said that his faith and personal encounter with Tucker had changed his position entirely. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 16-0 against clemency. Governor George W. Bush declined to grant a 30-day reprieve. Every appeal, including a last-minute filing to the United States Supreme Court challenging the clemency procedures, was denied. On February 3, 1998, Carla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit.
She was 38 years old. She was the first woman executed in Texas since 1863, 135 years, and the 437th person executed in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment. Her final statement expressed sorrow to the families of both victims and her faith in God. The Karla Faye Tucker case never resolved into something clean or settled. It became instead a permanent fixture in conversations about redemption, about the purpose of punishment, about whether a justice system should be capable of accounting for a person's transformation rather than only their worst moment. Those who believed it should cited 14 years of documented change and the appeals of a victim's own family. Those who believed it should not cited the original act and the principle that the terms of justice cannot shift with a defendant's sincerity. Both arguments were fully formed. Neither has since gone quiet.
Case 3. Andrea Yates. This is the heartbreaking and deeply unsettling story of a Texas mother who committed an act so unthinkable that it left the entire nation struggling to make sense of what they were hearing. An act carried out not in a moment of rage, but in an eerie, terrifying calm. Andrea Yates is one of the most discussed and contested cases in American criminal history, not because the facts of what happened are disputed, they are not, but because of what those facts reveal about the failures of every system designed to prevent exactly this kind of outcome: the medical system, the insurance system, the social environment, the religious framework that shaped the family's daily choices, and the legal system that first convicted her and then, on the second attempt, reached a different conclusion entirely. Every layer of the Yates case, when examined honestly, contains a failure, and those failures cost 5 young children their lives. Her victims were her 5 young children: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary, the oldest just 7 years old, the youngest only 6 months. The case ignited fierce national debate, went through 2 separate trials, and produced 2 completely different verdicts. The controversy at its core has never stopped burning. We ranked this case at number 3 because it is not simply a crime story, it is an indictment of an entire system that saw the danger coming and still failed to stop it. But what was really going on inside Andrea Yates' mind in those final moments? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Andrea Kennedy was born in February of 1964 in Hallsville, Texas. By most accounts, she was academically accomplished, pursued nursing as a profession, and carried the quiet competence of someone who approaches responsibility seriously. She met Russell Yates in the late 1980s, and they married in April of 1993. Both were devoted Christians, and the marriage from the beginning was shaped by a particular religious conviction that would, over time, become one of the most significant factors in what unfolded. The couple had 5 children in rapid succession: Noah in 1994, John in 1995, Paul in 1997, Luke in 1999, and Mary in November of 2000. The pace placed enormous physical and psychological strain on Andrea. After the birth of the first child, she experienced what appeared to be a brief psychiatric episode. After the birth of the fourth, the situation became acute. She made 2 attempts on her own life, one involving medication and one involving a sharp implement, leading to hospitalizations and diagnoses of severe postpartum depression with psychotic features. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, delivered a direct and documented warning to the couple. Having more children would, in all probability, guarantee further episodes of psychotic depression. That warning is in the medical record. It was explicit. Both Andrea and Rusty were made aware of it, and yet, by early 2000, Andrea was pregnant again. Mary was born in November of 2000. Within months, Andrea's condition had deteriorated severely. She hallucinated. She experienced prolonged periods of catatonia. She scratched a bald patch into her own scalp from anxiety. She stopped speaking for extended stretches, and woven through all of it were religious delusions telling her that she was a corrupting influence on her children, that her perceived sins had doomed them to eternal suffering, and that the only way to protect their souls was to end their lives while they were still young enough to be considered innocent. This is the core of what forensic psychiatrists later described as postpartum psychosis, a condition categorically different from postpartum depression, involving breaks from reality so complete that the person experiencing them cannot access ordinary moral reasoning. Andrea Yates was not, in the clinical understanding that eventually prevailed, making a choice in the sense most people use that word. She was acting from within a delusional framework so total and consuming that she believed completely, without a shadow of doubt, that what she was doing was the most protective act available to her as a mother. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, after Rusty left for work and before his mother arrived to help with the children, Andrea went to the bathroom of their Clear Lake home. She filled the bathtub. She called her children to her one by one. She drowned Paul, Luke, and John sequentially, carrying each small body to the master bedroom and placing them on the bed beneath a sheet. She drowned 6-month-old Mary in the same way. 7-year-old Noah came to the bathroom door, saw his infant sister in the water, and understood enough to try to run. Andrea caught him and brought him back. She then called 911 and her husband, and reported calmly and without apparent emotion what she had done. When police arrived, she met them outside. The 2002 trial was one of the most watched in Texas history. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, charging her with capital murder for 3 of the 5 deaths. The defense argued legal insanity under the McNaughton standard, that due to her psychosis, she did not know her actions were wrong. A jury convicted her and sentenced her to life in prison, rejecting the insanity argument. The conviction fell apart on appeal in 2005. Prosecution expert Dr. Park Dietz had testified that he recalled a specific Law & Order television episode in which a woman drowned her children and was acquitted by reason of insanity, implying Andrea may have been inspired by it. No such episode existed. Dietz acknowledged the error. The Texas Court of Appeals found the false testimony could have affected the outcome and overturned the conviction. At the 2006 retrial, jurors heard a much fuller account of Andrea's documented psychiatric history, multiple hospitalizations, suicide attempts, explicit medical warnings that had been dismissed, and the postpartum psychosis that had completely fractured her perception of reality. They found her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to Kerrville State Hospital rather than prison. Andrea Yates has remained at Kerrville since 2007, repeatedly waiving her annual review hearings rather than seek release, a decision that observers have interpreted as a form of sustained grief and unwillingness to claim a normal life. Her marriage to Rusty did not survive. They divorced in 2004. What the case ultimately asks of those willing to sit with it honestly is not the legal question, that was eventually resolved, but whether every system surrounding Andrea Yates did everything that could have been done. A psychiatrist gave a clear warning. Insurance limitations shortened the hospitalizations that might have changed the outcome. A religious environment discouraged the consistent treatment that was medically necessary. 5 children are gone. No legal outcome has changed that.
Case 4. Candace Candy Montgomery. This is the story that turned a quiet suburban Texas neighborhood upside down. The account of a church-going housewife and mother who became the central figure in one of the most debated criminal cases in the state's history, involving a crime that no one in her community ever saw coming. The case of Candy Montgomery is, on its surface, about a killing. But beneath that surface, it is about something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling, the specific violence that can erupt in the most ordinary settings when the private and the domestic collide without warning. There is no organized criminal background here. There is no financial motive of any significant scale. There is instead a suburban Friday morning in June of 1980, 2 women in a utility room in a conversation that neither of them had entirely prepared for. What came out of that room redefined a small Texas community's understanding of what their neighbors were capable of and left the courtroom divided in a way that has never been fully resolved. Candy Montgomery's victim was Betty Gore, 29, a fellow churchgoer, a neighbor, a mother, found inside her own home in Wiley, Texas. The brutality of what was discovered left investigators stunned.
The controversy? A jury heard all the evidence and still walked Candy Montgomery out of that courtroom a free woman. We ranked this case at number 4 because it exposes the disturbing truth that danger does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the most familiar face in the room. But what truly happened inside that house on that Friday morning? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Candy Montgomery, born Candace Lynn Wheeler, was a housewife and mother living in Wiley, Texas in the late 1970s. She was actively involved in the First United Methodist Church of Lucas, a congregation that served as the social hub for many of the young families in the area. Through that church, she came to know Betty Gore, another housewife, another mother, someone whose daily life moved in the same circles and ran on many of the same rhythms. The two women were friendly, their children played together, their husbands knew each other. From a distance, this was the kind of community bond that looks like the fabric of a safe neighborhood. In late summer of 1978, Candy approached Betty's husband, Alan Gore, after a church volleyball game and proposed an affair. The directness of the approach was unusual, a married woman in a church environment treating an extramarital arrangement as a practical negotiation rather than a transgression to be concealed. Alan agreed. The affair began on December 12, 1978, and lasted approximately 11 months. It continued even after Betty gave birth to the couple's second child. It ended when Alan, having attended a marriage encounter program with Betty and committed to repairing their marriage, told Candy in October of 1979 that it was over. Both families remained in the same social circle. The women continued on speaking terms.
On June 13, 1980, a Friday, Alan was out of town on a business trip. Candy came to the Gore home that morning to retrieve a swimsuit for the Gore's older daughter, who had spent the night at the Montgomery house. Betty was home with her infant daughter. What began as a brief domestic errand became a confrontation. According to Candy's eventual testimony, Betty brought up the affair. Candy acknowledged it but confirmed it was over. The exchange escalated. The two women ended up in the utility room of the Gore home, where a wood-splitting axe was stored. Betty Gore was found that afternoon after Alan, unable to reach her by phone from his business trip, asked neighbors to check on her. Betty was 29 years old. Her infant daughter was unharmed in her crib. Evidence at the scene, a bloody footprint, fingerprints, pointed to Candy Montgomery. She surrendered to authorities on June 27, 1980, after an arrest warrant was issued. At trial, Candy's attorneys, led by Don Crowder, made an unusual strategic decision. They told the jury directly that their client had killed Betty Gore. The question, they argued, was not whether she had done it, but whether she was legally justified. Their defense rested on Candy's claim that Betty had picked up the axe first and struck her, cutting her toe. In the struggle that followed, Candy had taken control of the weapon. What came next, the defense argued, resulted from a psychological break, a dissociative response triggered by buried trauma and the physical confrontation, rather than from intentional murder. The prosecution countered with what seemed a straightforward observation: 41 strikes cannot be characterized as the minimum necessary to defend oneself. At some point, a genuine act of self-defense stops. The subsequent cleanup of the scene and Candy's ability to resume her day normally also pointed, the state argued, to a person in command of their faculties, not a person in the grip of panic. Both interpretations placed contradictory claims before the jury simultaneously and in equal force. The jury, 9 women and 3 men, deliberated for somewhere between 3 and 4.5 hours before returning a not guilty verdict on both murder and manslaughter charges on October 30, 1980. The courtroom erupted. Spectators shouted at Montgomery as she departed. Betty Gore's father stated that justice would come through Candy having to live with what she had done. Community members who had known Betty felt that something structural had broken that day in the courthouse, that an answer had been given that did not feel like one. Montgomery and her husband Pat divorced in 1986. She moved with her family to Georgia and has lived privately under her maiden name, Wheeler, in the decades since. Her lead attorney, Don Crowder, died in 1994. The case remained embedded in Texas legal culture, the subject of a book, documentary treatment, and 2 prominent television adaptations, largely because it refuses to settle. A jury found self-defense credible. The number 41 pushes back against it endlessly.
What happened in that utility room on a Friday morning in June of 1980 is a question whose courtroom answer and whose factual answer have never been confirmed to be the same thing. Case 5. Christine Marie Paulia. This is a story that begins with kindness and ends in one of the most devastating betrayals imaginable. The account of a Houston teenager who committed an act of violence against the very people who had shown her the most compassion, in a quiet suburban neighborhood that never expected to make national headlines. The Clear Lake area of Houston carries the particular orderliness of communities built around institutions, in this case, NASA's Johnson Space Center, which gives the neighborhood a middle-class solidity, a presumption of safety, and a suburban geography designed to feel insulated from the kind of stories that end up in courtrooms. Brook Forest, the subdivision at the center of this case, looked like exactly that on the afternoon of July 18, 2003. Quiet streets, maintained lawns, and inside a house on Millbridge Drive, 4 young people who had no warning of what was coming. Her victims were 4 young people in the prime of their lives, including Rachel Coloradus and Tiffany Rowell, the 2 girls who had befriended Christine when no one else would, voted her Miss Irresistible, and shown her genuine kindness. The case went cold for 3 years before a single tip cracked it wide open. We ranked this case at number 5 because the tragic irony at its center, that kindness itself became a fatal connection, makes it one of the most emotionally devastating cases on this entire list. But what could possibly have led Christine Paulia to turn on the people who cared for her most? Let's jump into the details to find out. Christine Marie Paulia was born on March 31, 1986 in Long Island, New York. Her early years were shaped by significant loss. Her father died of a drug overdose when she was young, leaving the family in financial difficulty. The family relocated to Texas, where Christine navigated adolescence carrying grief that had never been properly processed. She also lived with alopecia areata, an autoimmune condition that causes hair loss across the scalp. For a teenager in a high school environment, this was not a minor detail. She wore wigs. She was an easy target. The social cruelty that followed was sustained and systematic. What changed Christine's social world at Clear Lake High School was the unexpected kindness of 2 girls, Rachel Coloradus and Tiffany Rowell. Both were socially confident, and both, for reasons that speak well of who they were, chose to befriend the isolated new student. They helped her with her appearance, included her in their activities, and had her voted Miss Irresistible in a school contest. For a while, it appeared Christine had found something stable to hold on to, but she had also found something else: drugs. By her teenage years, she was using heroin and other substances, and her relationship with Rachel and Tiffany, the girls who had shown her genuine kindness, was being slowly corroded by addiction's particular effect on human connection. By 2003, at 17, Christine was in a relationship with an 18-year-old named Christopher Snyder, who was also heavily involved in substance use. The two were, by multiple accounts, financially desperate and seeking narcotics. What investigators eventually pieced together was a picture of a robbery, a plan to go to Tiffany Rowell's home and take drugs and money. On the afternoon of July 18, 2003, Christine and Snyder arrived at the Rowell home on Millbridge Drive. Tiffany Rowell, 18, and her best friend Rachel Coloradus, also 18, both recent Clear Lake High School graduates, were there, along with Marcus Priscilla, 19, Tiffany's boyfriend, and Adelbert Sanchez, 21, Marcus's cousin. 4 people, in a living room, on an ordinary Houston afternoon. What happened inside that house was described by investigators as an execution-style attack. All 4 victims were fatally shot at close range. The bodies were discovered around 3:30 in the afternoon. The manner of the attack communicated deliberate intent rather than chaos. This was not an encounter that escalated accidentally. All 4 people in that room died. Tiffany Rowell and Rachel Coloradus, the young women who had voted Christine Miss Irresistible and extended her genuine friendship, were among them. The case went unsolved for 3 years. Composite sketches of a male and female seen near the home were released in 2004, but without additional leads, the investigation stalled. In 2006, a Crime Stoppers tip broke it open. Christine Paella was identified and arrested on July 19, 2006, in San Antonio. Christopher Snyder, located in South Carolina, died by suicide before authorities could bring him into custody. He was never prosecuted. This left Christine to face charges alone. Her defense argued that her interrogation statements were unreliable because she had been suffering from heroin withdrawal at the time of questioning, affecting the voluntariness of her account. A defense psychiatrist testified to this effect. The attorneys also emphasized that Snyder had been the dominant force in the relationship and portrayed Christine as a troubled young woman shaped by years of bullying, family loss, addiction, and grief that had never been addressed. The prosecution's position was direct. Christine Paella was not a passive presence. She was there. She was involved. 4 people who had been kind to her were dead. The trial in Harris County concluded on October 13, 2008. The jury convicted Christine on 4 counts of capital murder. Because she was 17 at the time of the offense, and under the United States Supreme Court's ruling in Roper v. Simmons, which prohibited capital punishment for crimes committed before the age of 18, she was not eligible for the death penalty. She received an automatic life sentence with parole eligibility after 40 years, meaning she would not be considered for parole until 2046, when she would be 60 years old. She remains incarcerated at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. The distance between who Christine Paella was at the beginning of her high school years, a grieving, isolated girl shown unexpected kindness by 2 teenagers who owed her nothing, and who she became on July 18, 2003, is one of the most painful dimensions of this case to sit with. Not because it explains what she did, nothing fully explains it, but because it shows how many points along the way the story could have been redirected. A father who didn't die, an addiction caught earlier, a relationship that never started. The fact that the names of Rachel Coloraudis and Tiffany Rowell, the girls who had been kind to her, appear among the victims is the part of this case that does not release its hold.
Case 6. Diana Lambrera. This is the haunting account of a Texas woman whose trail of tragedy stretched across 2 states and nearly 14 years. A series of deaths so consistently disguised as heartbreak that no single person ever saw the full picture until it was far too late for far too many. There is a particular cruelty in crimes that hide themselves inside grief. When a child dies under unexplained circumstances, the instinct of any community, any doctor, any neighbor, any family member, is to reach first toward the mother with comfort rather than scrutiny. That instinct is correct nearly every time. It is designed to be. The horror of the Diana Lambrera case is not simply what she did, but how completely she understood the protection that instinct provides, and how systematically she used it over a period of 14 years. Her victims were her own children, infants and toddlers, each death seemingly isolated, each one mourned loudly and publicly. The controversy lived in the years between each loss, and in the life insurance policies that existed for every single one of them. We ranked this case at number 6 because it is the starkest example on this list of how a pattern of evil can hide in plain sight when grief becomes the most effective weapon of all. But how did Diana Lambrera maintain this for over a decade without anyone stopping her? Let's jump into the details to find out. Lambrera was born in 1958 and grew up in rural Texas as the oldest child in a large family. She left school early and married young, entering domestic life in the small towns of the Texas Panhandle, places like Friona and Bovina, where community was tight and personal history was well known. Her second marriage, to a man named Lionel Garza in 1977, was turbulent, marked by arguments, separations, and reconciliations, but produced children amid the instability. The first death came in 1976. Joanna, a 3-month-old infant, died. The cause was recorded as natural. In the small-town environment, the death of an infant was a tragedy that brought communal sympathy. Lambrera received it with a dramatic, overwhelming grief that would, over time, become a characteristic feature of every death connected to her. She fainted. She wept publicly. She described herself as a mother pursued by tragedy, a woman to whom the worst possible things kept happening without explanation. For a while, for years, the people around her accepted that framing without resistance.
More deaths followed through the late 1970s and early 1980s. Melissa, Melinda, Lewis, additional children in her care. Each death was attributed to natural causes: sudden infant death syndrome, respiratory illness, conditions that small-town medical examiners, without the context of what had come before, certified without prolonged investigation. Each time, Lumbrera collected on modest life insurance policies she had taken out on the children. The amounts were not large, $5,000 in some instances, but the pattern of their existence was consistent. And each time she positioned herself at the center of communal sympathy, a grieving mother who could not understand why God kept taking her children. Lionel Garza later testified that after the third child's death, his own suspicions had begun to form. He described noticing that a child appeared healthy and then minutes later receiving an urgent report from Lumbrera that the child was unresponsive. The time between apparent wellness and reported emergency was too short for the explanation she offered. He voiced his doubts privately. He did not, at that point, report them formally, a decision that many would weigh heavily in retrospect. The couple divorced around 1980. Lumbrera moved on. New relationships, new locations, new children, and the same pattern continued. By the mid-1980s, she had relocated to Garden City, Kansas, where she carried her youngest child, 4-year-old Jose Antonio, to the emergency room at St. Catherine's Hospital on May 1, 1990. He was pronounced dead after resuscitation efforts failed. A pathologist identified findings inconsistent with natural causes. Investigators were notified, and for the first time, the pattern building across a decade and a half in Texas came fully into view. Once authorities in Kansas began communicating with counterparts in Texas, the scope of what had been occurring became impossible to dismiss. Cases previously certified as natural deaths were reviewed. Medical examiners revisited earlier findings with the context of a pattern rather than isolated incidents. The investigation that followed resulted in prosecutions across 2 states. Lumbrera's first Kansas trial for Jose's death ended in conviction, but the Kansas Supreme Court reversed it in 1992, citing cumulative trial errors, among them the handling of testimony related to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a recognized behavioral pattern in which a caregiver induces illness in a dependent for attention or sympathy that had compromised the fairness of the proceedings. A retrial in 1993 produced a second conviction and a life sentence. Texas authorities then pursued cases from the earlier deaths. Rather than risk full trials on each count, Lumbrera entered guilty or no contest pleas in exchange for life sentences. In one case involving her daughter Melissa, she pleaded guilty explicitly in order to avoid potential capital punishment. The pleas resolved the cases without requiring juries to evaluate each death individually. Lumbrera was eventually transferred to Texas custody around 2004. She is currently 67 years old and remains incarcerated at the Mountain View unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The case threw into uncomfortable relief a set of structural vulnerabilities that had enabled the pattern for so long. Small communities where a grieving mother is extended sympathy rather than scrutiny by default, under-resourced medical examiner systems without the connective tissue to identify patterns across years and locations, and the cultural assumption that a mother's expressed grief is always, without exception, what it appears to be. 14 years, 7 children or more, and a pattern that became visible only when someone looked at all of it at once.
Case 7. Betty Lou Beets. This is the story of a Texas woman whose life was as complicated as any on this list. A woman who sat on death row not just because of what she did, but because of a legal battle over whether the full story of who she was ever truly made it into that courtroom. Before she became the second woman executed in Texas following the reinstatement of capital punishment, before her name entered the legal record as a study in the tension between established motive and unexamined mitigation, before the news cameras arrived outside the Huntsville unit on February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was a woman whose biography resisted easy summarization. Not because its central facts were ambiguous, they were not, but because those facts existed alongside a documented personal history that the justice system, in the end, chose not to weigh heavily enough. Or at least that was the argument of the people fighting to prevent her execution. The state of Texas reached a different conclusion.
Her victims were two of her husbands, their remains discovered buried on her own Texas property near Lake Athens. And the prosecution built its case around one of the oldest motives in the legal playbook. The controversy was not about guilt, but about whether the sentence was reached with the full truth in the room. We ranked this case at number 7 because it forces one of the most uncomfortable questions in all of criminal justice. Not just what a person did, but whether the system that judged them was truly complete. But what was really driving Betty Lou Beets behind closed doors all those years? Let's jump into the details to find out. Beets was born on March 12, 1937, into difficult rural Texas circumstances. Her life as a young woman was defined by early marriage and chronic instability, a pattern that extended across multiple relationships. By the time the criminal case against her was constructed, she had been married 6 times, twice to the same man. Her personal history included, by her own account and that of later advocates, repeated experiences of violence across her lifetime, abuse that she and her supporters claimed had begun in childhood and continued into her marriages, and that defense attorneys would argue had never been adequately raised at the trial that sentenced her to death. She had a prior history involving a firearm before the crimes at issue. In 1970, she had shot her second husband during what she described as a self-defense situation and was acquitted. In a separate incident, she was involved in a confrontation with a third husband involving a vehicle. These episodes accumulated in the background of a life that followed no simple trajectory. By the early 1980s, she was living in Henderson County, Texas, near Lake Athens, first with her fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, and then her fifth, Jimmy Don Beets, a retired Dallas firefighter. The prosecution's theory of the case was financial. Beets had ended both men's lives for the insurance proceeds and financial benefits attached to their deaths.
For Jimmy Don Beets, she attempted to take out a life insurance policy on him without his knowledge, pursued his pension benefits after his disappearance, and reported him missing with the claim that his boat had overturned accidentally on the lake, a scenario she staged. For Doyle Wayne Barker, whose remains were found on the same property, the financial element was also central to the state's presentation. The discovery of the remains came in 1985, following a tip to law enforcement that prompted a search of the property. Under a decorative wishing well in the front yard, investigators found Jimmy Don's remains. Under a storage shed at the rear of the property, they found Barker's remains. Both men had been shot with a .38 caliber firearm. Betty Lou Beets was arrested and charged with capital murder, specifically murder committed for financial gain, which qualifies as a capital offense under Texas law. Trial testimony came significantly from her own children. Her daughter, Shirley Stenger, testified that she had been present and involved in the concealment of Barker's remains after the shooting, assisting with the disposal and covering of the burial site. Her son, Robert Branson, testified that he helped conceal Jimmy Don's body under the wishing well after discovering the scene inside the home. Both had accepted plea agreements in exchange for their cooperation. Beets countered by accusing her children of the actual killings, but the jury did not find that account credible. She was convicted on October 11, 1985, and sentenced to death 3 days later. The sentence was twice reversed on legal technicalities, including an issue with the conduct of one of her defense attorneys, but was reinstated each time. What her supporters argued most consistently was not that she was innocent, but that the full history of her exposure to violence across a lifetime had never been properly presented to the jury that made the sentencing decision, and that a jury with that information might have reached a different conclusion about punishment. Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, and United Nations human rights officials all made representations on her behalf in the period before the execution. Governor George W. Bush denied clemency. A federal appeals court upheld the sentence days before the scheduled execution date. All remaining legal paths were closed. On the evening of February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. She was 62 years old, the oldest woman executed in Texas at that time. She made no final statement and requested no special last meal. She was the second woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of capital punishment, and the 18th person executed nationally in the year 2000. She was never tried for Barker's death, the existing sentence having rendered further prosecution unnecessary.
The Betty Lou Beets case remains among the most contested female executions in modern American legal history, not on the question of factual guilt, which the physical evidence and family testimony addressed substantially, but on whether the process by which she was sentenced adequately accounted for who she was and what her life had contained. The state held that the financial motive was established and the penalty warranted. Her advocates held that a sentencing determination made without full understanding of a defendant's documented history is one reached with incomplete information. Both arguments were fully formed, coherently made, and unresolved by the execution. They remain so.
Case 8. Darlie Lynn Routier. This is arguably the most contested and debated case in the history of Texas criminal justice. The story of a Rowlett mother who has spent nearly 3 decades on death row insisting she is innocent, in a case where the forensic evidence has been argued, re-argued, and never fully settled to anyone's complete satisfaction. The Routier case has never fully left the public consciousness, and the reason has less to do with the facts themselves than with what it represents as an ongoing legal question. It is one of the most debated potential wrongful conviction cases in Texas history. It is also, depending on whose forensic analysis you find persuasive, a case of calculated staging and deliberate harm to the most vulnerable people in a family's home. These two interpretations have coexisted for nearly 30 years, and no development in the legal or forensic record has yet resolved them to the satisfaction of both sides. Her victims were her own 2 young sons, Devin, age 6, and Damon, age 5, stabbed in their own family room while the rest of the house slept. The controversy? 30 years later, no one has fully agreed on what actually happened that night, and Darlie Routier still sits on death row with no execution date ever set. We rank this case at number 8 because it is the one case on this list where the question of guilt itself remains open, making it the most legally and morally unresolved story we have. But what really happened inside that Rowlett home on that summer night? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Darlie Lynn Routier was born on January 4, 1970, in Pennsylvania, and moved to Texas as a young woman. She married Darren Routier in 1988 at the age of 18. The couple built a comfortable life in Rowlett, a suburban community northeast of Dallas. Darren ran a screen printing business, and they lived in a 2-story home in the Dow Rock Heights subdivision. They had 3 sons, Devin, born in 1989, Damon, born in 1991, and Drake, born in late 1995. To those who knew the family, they appeared to be exactly what they looked like, a young household managing the ordinary demands of raising young children. By mid-1996, the image had acquired pressure points. Darren's business was struggling financially, and the family carried significant debt alongside mortgage obligations. These pressures are not unusual in American family life, and under ordinary circumstances they would have gone unnoticed. They became relevant only in the context of what happened in the early morning hours of June 6, 1996. Darlie called 911 at 2:31 in the morning. She told the operator that someone had broken into her home and attacked her family. Police arrived within minutes and found Devin, age 6, and Damon, age 5, in the downstairs family room with life-threatening injuries from stab wounds. Devin did not survive. Damon was transported to the hospital, but died despite intensive efforts. Drake, the infant, was upstairs with Darren, unharmed. Darlie herself had been injured, a deep wound to her throat and lacerations to her arm, which she attributed to a physical struggle with the intruder, a man she described as having fled through the garage after she confronted him.
The investigation in the hours and days that followed produced a collection of physical evidence that, in the prosecution's interpretation, told a very different story. A cut window screen in the garage, which Darlie identified as the intruder's entry point, showed characteristics that investigators argued were inconsistent with having been cut from outside. A bloody sock containing the children's blood was recovered approximately 75 yards down the alley behind the house, too precisely placed, prosecutors contended, for someone fleeing in urgency. Bloodstain pattern analysis conducted by forensic expert Tom Bevel suggested that Darlie's physical positions during the events were inconsistent with having been asleep on the sofa at the time the attacks began. Luminol testing reportedly indicated that blood had been cleaned from the kitchen sink. Darley's injuries became a central point of dispute. The prosecution argued they were self-inflicted, designed specifically to support the intruder narrative, and pointed to their comparative nature relative to the children's fatal wounds. Medical experts called by the defense responded that the throat wound, which came within millimeters of the carotid artery, was not consistent with a deliberate self-inflicted injury. This disagreement was never definitively resolved at trial. The detail that arguably had the largest impact on the jury was a piece of videotape. 10 days after the deaths, during a cemetery visit near Devon's birthday, Darley and family members sprayed silly string over the boys' graves and sang "Happy Birthday." The footage was captured and broadcast. Prosecutors presented it as evidence of a demeanor inconsistent with genuine maternal grief. Darley's supporters have argued for years that the video was selectively broadcast, that the full footage showed her in evident distress, and that the birthday observance was a specific ritual decided upon to honor Devon in a manner consistent with his personality. The jury reportedly replayed the footage multiple times during deliberations. The trial was held in Kerrville in February of 1997 after a venue change due to the intensity of local publicity. Darley was charged only with Damon's murder. She was convicted on February 4, 1997, and sentenced to death. She was 27 years old at sentencing. She has never been tried for Devon's death. She has remained on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, for nearly 3 decades. Courts authorized limited DNA testing in 2008, and additional testing has been sought across subsequent years. As of 2026, no DNA result has publicly established the presence of an unknown third party in the home, though Darley's legal team continues to press for more comprehensive testing of items including the bloody sock. No execution date has ever been set. Darley has maintained her innocence consistently and completely. She declined a post-conviction offer of a life sentence, a decision that her supporters cite as evidence of her conviction in her own innocence, and that prosecutors read differently. Her ex-husband, Darren, who supported her publicly for years, divorced her in 2011. He has not been charged and has denied deeper involvement. What the Routier case refuses to offer 30 years on is resolution. The forensic evidence was contested at trial and remains contested. The silly string footage was presented as damning and has been reinterpreted as misunderstood. Darley Routier sits on death row maintaining her account, and the question of what actually happened in that family room on the night of June 6, 1996, has not in any direction been definitively answered. Case 9. Deanna Laney. This is one of the most deeply disturbing and emotionally complex cases ever to come out of the state of Texas. The story of an East Texas mother, known to her neighbors as gentle and deeply devout, who carried out an act of unspeakable violence against her own children that no one in her community ever believed possible. When people discuss the insanity defense in American courts, the conversation tends toward the abstract, the legal mechanism, the constitutional protection, the theoretical framework for cases in which mental illness is cited as removing criminal responsibility. What the Deanna Laney case did was bring that abstraction into painful contact with an actual crime, an actual family, and an East Texas community that had known Laney as a neighbor, a homeschooling mother, and a church-going woman who waved from her driveway and appeared in every visible way entirely ordinary. Her victims were her own sons, Joshua, 8, and Luke, 6, in the front yard of their new Chapel Hill home, while 14-month-old Aaron survived with permanent brain damage. The verdict that followed shocked the community. The controversy has never stopped. We ranked this case at number 9 because it sits at the most painful intersection of religion, mental illness, and justice, a place where the law gave an answer that the human heart still struggles to accept. But what was Deanna Laney truly experiencing in the months and moments leading up to that night? Let's jump into the details to find out. Deanna Laney lived with her husband Keith and their children in New Chapel Hill, a small community near Tyler in Smith County. By the accounts of those who knew her, she was a devout Pentecostal Christian who structured much of her family's life around her faith, homeschooling the children, attending services regularly, engaging actively with her congregation.
Nothing about her external presentation suggested that anything was wrong. But beneath that surface, for approximately 4 years before the events of May 9, 2003, Deanna Laney was experiencing a deteriorating psychosis that was visible only in fragments to those closest to her, and even then, those fragments were not recognized for what they were. She told members of her church that the world was ending. She described receiving direct communications from God, not metaphorical spiritual impressions, but what she experienced as literal, specific instructions. She interpreted everyday occurrences, a child handling a spear-like object, events she observed in her environment, as divine messages confirming that an apocalypse was imminent and that her family had been chosen for a particular role within it. She discussed these beliefs with her pastor and with family members. No one intervened. The accounts of those around her suggest they did not recognize the severity of what they were hearing as symptoms of a psychiatric condition, rather than intense, if unconventional, religious conviction. The delusion that forensic psychiatrists later identified as the defining element of her psychotic state was specific. Laney believed that God had instructed her to demonstrate her faith by taking the lives of her children, a command she understood as analogous to God's biblical test of Abraham. She experienced this instruction as literal and urgent. She described having struggled with it, loving her children, not wanting to harm them, but believing that disobeying what she understood as a divine command would result in consequences far worse than the act of compliance. Multiple forensic evaluators who examined her after her arrest consistently described this as a deific command experience, an instruction she believed came directly from God and that her delusional state gave her no psychological capacity to refuse.
Late on the night of May 9, 2003, while Keith slept, Laney went to the room of her 8-year-old son, Joshua. She woke him and led him out to the front yard of their home. She found a large rock, lifted it, and brought it down on his head with force. Joshua died. She returned inside and brought her 6-year-old son Luke out to the same location and used the rock to take his life as well. She then went to the crib of 14-month-old Aaron and struck his head with a stone, causing a fractured skull and permanent brain damage. Aaron survived. Afterward, Laney called 911. The recording of that call was played at trial and stood as one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the proceedings. In it, she spoke with a stillness that multiple expert witnesses described as consistent, not with deliberate cruelty, but with a person whose mind was entirely disconnected from the reality available to everyone else in the room. She told the operator she had used a rock. She provided her address. She noted, in a phrase that stayed with everyone who heard it, that she did not believe she had done right by Aaron, not because of the harm she had caused him, but because she feared she had failed to fully execute what she understood to be a divine instruction. Deputies arriving at the scene found the bodies of Joshua and Luke in the front yard and Aaron inside, badly injured but alive. Laney cooperated fully and provided a full confession without resistance. The Smith County trial in March and April of 2004 was procedurally unusual. Both the prosecution and defense agreed on the facts. The central question was whether Deanna Laney, at the moment the acts occurred, had the mental capacity to understand that what she was doing was wrong, the standard required by the McNaughton test, which governs the insanity defense under Texas law. The prosecution presented the full evidence of the attacks without softening them and argued that the jury, rather than experts, should make the determination of sanity. The defense presented multiple forensic psychiatrists who testified to the duration and severity of Laney's psychotic break. The court's neutral expert, Dr. William Reed, was cited by jurors as particularly significant in their deliberations. After approximately 7 hours, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a maximum security psychiatric facility rather than prison. The verdict generated immediate public outrage. Critics argued it allowed the acts to go without adequate consequence. Psychiatric professionals and legal scholars responded that the insanity standard Laney met was among the most stringently applied in American courts, that deific command hallucinations represent a specific and severe category of psychotic break that courts have long recognized as meeting the legal threshold for insanity. In May of 2012, after a closed hearing in which her treating physicians determined she no longer presented a danger, Deanna Laney was released. Her location was not publicly disclosed.
The Smith County District Attorney noted at the time that the court had followed the law as written. Whether that legal answer satisfies the families of Joshua and Luke Laney is a question that no court proceeding has addressed, because it is not a question that courts are designed to answer.
Case 10. Jean Jones. This is the most terrifying case on this entire list. The account of a San Antonio pediatric nurse who was believed to have harmed, and in many cases killed, dozens of the most vulnerable patients imaginable. Infants and small children who could not speak for themselves, brought in by families who placed absolute trust in the hands of their caregivers. There is a word that appears in nearly every serious discussion of the Jean Jones case: trust. It appears because trust is the precise thing she exploited, and because the violation of it in her story sits at the outermost edge of any scale used to measure the betrayal of professional responsibility. When a family brings a sick infant to a hospital or clinic, they are doing the most elemental thing that vulnerability requires. They are placing their child's life entirely in the hands of strangers. They have almost no capacity to observe, evaluate, or second-guess what happens once the child is in the care of the nurses and physicians responsible for treatment. That trust is not naive, it is structurally unavoidable, and Jean Jones understood, with a precision that investigators and prosecutors spent years documenting, exactly how to operate inside that structural unavoidability. Her victims included infants as young as 15 months, among them little Chelsea McClellan, whose mother held her in her arms at what she believed was a routine clinic visit. The controversy? The full number of her victims may never be known, because thousands of hospital records were destroyed before investigators could reach them. We ranked this case at number 10, the final case on this list, because it is the most expansive, the most institutionally condemned, and arguably the most chilling betrayal of professional trust in American medical history. But what was truly driving Jean Jones to do what she did, inside the walls of places families believed were the safest rooms in the world? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Jones was born on July 13, 1950 in San Antonio, Texas. She trained as a licensed vocational nurse and in the early 1980s was working in the pediatric intensive care unit at Bexar County Hospital, now University Hospital, in San Antonio. The unit treated some of the most critically ill infants and young children in the region, giving Jones direct access to vulnerable patients and to the full spectrum of medications used in intensive pediatric care. The pattern that would eventually lead investigators toward her was first visible statistically. During periods when Jones worked what colleagues called the death shift, the 3 to 11 in the evening rotation, infants and young children were dramatically more likely to experience unexplained cardiac events and to die than during comparable periods when she was not present. One retrospective analysis suggested that patients were up to 25 times more likely to suffer such an episode during her shifts. Medical emergencies clustered around her schedule in a way that had no clinical explanation, rooted in the severity of the patient population. Colleagues noticed that Jones frequently positioned herself at the center of these emergencies, that she was often the first to identify a deteriorating patient, the most energized during crisis situations rather than distressed by them, and that she appeared to struggle during quieter shifts when no emergencies arose. These observations were noted internally. The hospital conducted a review, but rather than reporting concerns to law enforcement or to the Texas Nursing Board in a manner that would prevent further access to patients, administrators allowed Jones to leave with a positive employment recommendation.
She was not prohibited from practicing nursing. She was not referred for investigation. She moved to a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, run by a physician named Dr. Kathleen Holland. The decision to allow her departure without external notification is one of the most consequential institutional choices in this story, and it was made not by Jones, but by those responsible for managing her. In Kerrville, the pattern continued. Children brought to the clinic for routine appointments or minor conditions began experiencing sudden, serious medical emergencies. The case that would anchor the criminal prosecution involved a 15-month-old girl named Chelsea McClellan. Chelsea's mother, Petty, brought her to the clinic in September of 1982. According to trial evidence, Jones administered an injection of succinylcholine into Chelsea's thigh while Petty held her daughter.
Succinylcholine is a powerful paralytic drug used in anesthesia. When administered without the mechanical ventilation support of an operating environment, it causes the muscles required for breathing to cease functioning while the person remains conscious. Chelsea began struggling almost immediately. Jones administered a second injection of the same substance despite the child's visible distress. Emergency transport followed, with Jones riding in the ambulance. Chelsea was pronounced dead at the receiving hospital. Toxicology confirmed the presence of succinylcholine in her system at levels sufficient to paralyze multiple adults. Chelsea McClellan was 15 months old. In the San Antonio PICU, another documented case involved 11-month-old Rolando Santos, who received repeated overdoses of heparin, a blood-thinning agent, causing excessive bleeding and near-fatal complications. Santos survived following medical intervention. This case became the basis of Jones's attempted murder conviction in Bexar County. Jones faced 2 trials in 1984, one in Kerrville for Chelsea McClellan's murder and one in Bexar County for the attempted murder of Rolando Santos. She was convicted in both proceedings and sentenced to 99 and 60 concurrent years in prison. For years, the sentences appeared to have resolved the matter. What nearly undid that resolution was not a court ruling on the merits of Jones's guilt, but a Texas law designed to address prison overcrowding, mandatory supervision provisions that gave Jones the ability to seek release after serving only a fraction of her sentence. By 2017, she had become eligible for potential release as early as March of 2018. Families of her victims, led most publicly by Petty McClellan, Chelsea's mother, who dedicated decades of her life to preventing Jones's release, campaigned against any possibility of her return to freedom. Prosecutors in Bexar County responded by reinvestigating cold case deaths from the San Antonio PICU and obtaining new murder indictments for 5 infants who had died during Jones's tenure: Joshua Sawyer, Rosemary Vega, Ricky Nelson, Patrick Zavala, and Paul Villarreal. These indictments prevented her release and resulted in her transfer to pretrial custody while the new cases proceeded. In January of 2020, Jones entered a plea agreement, guilty to the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer in exchange for the dismissal of the 4 remaining indictments. She received a life sentence with a minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility, a threshold that, accounting for time served, she would not reach until approximately 2037, when she would be in her late 80s. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Frank J. Castro addressed her directly, stating that she had taken what he described as the most precious gift imaginable, the lives of infants, while the families of her victims delivered statements accompanied by photographs of the children they had lost. Jones had maintained her innocence throughout the original prosecutions and the decades of incarceration that followed. In a letter written to nursing regulators during her imprisonment, she had described her past actions as heinous, a departure from her prior public position that represented a significant acknowledgement, if an incomplete one, for the families who had waited years for it. As of 2026, she remains incarcerated at the Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. The full scope of what she may have done has never been legally established. The number of suspicious deaths during her time in San Antonio and Kerrville, potentially 60 or more infants and young children, exceeds the cases the legal system was ultimately able to prosecute. Thousands of documents from Bexar County Hospital were destroyed or lost during and after the investigation, narrowing the evidential foundation for potential additional cases. The institution's choice to allow her departure with a positive recommendation rather than a law enforcement referral, a choice made by administrators protecting a reputation, remains the most significant secondary accountability question in a story that, at its center, is about one nurse and the patients whose families placed absolute trust in her hands.